Hi guys, this is Mathieu Frémaux aka Fremox. This video is a quick start tutorial for my MoglyphFX toolset. So without any waiting, let's go ahead and get started. So the first tab, Generate, this is where you will have to first select one of the existing cloner types. So knowing that the first one is for cloning onto path and it's called spline cloner. But to do so, you will need a spline that is drawn into your composition. So let's draw a simple spline here with the Bezier tool and just select it, and you can then clone onto this shape by clicking on this spline cloner. And as you can see, it will instantly create some clones onto the path. You can then deploy the object subgroup in the effects panel and play with the count, okay, the start, the end, and the offset. So if I play with the end and play with the offset, I can animate along the path, and the path is still editable. So if I go here and if I play with the path, as you can see, the clones are still bounded to the path. So it's pretty cool. So this is the first type of cloners. So let me remove this. And the second type is called linear cloner because, as its name says, it allows you to clone along a line. So click on it and it will ask you if you prefer to align the cloner onto the first clone or the middle one. If you want the first clone, you can click on yes. If you want the center one, you need to click on no. So let's click on no to center it on the middle one. And as you can see, if you select it and go into the effects panel and play with the objects settings, you can go, for example, in per step transform, and this is the position X that will offset the clones along the X axis. You can play with the position Y as well, making them like a diagonal direction. You can play with position Z if it's in 3D, but it's here in 2D. You can scale them on X, on Y, and rotate them on Z, for example. And as you can see, this is incremental, so it's per clone transform. This is why it's in the per step transform subgroup here. So the third one is a radial cloner. So as its icon suggests, it will clone your shapes along a ring. And of course you'll have, if you deploy the object settings here, a way to add more or less clones. And of course there is a radius, since it's a circle shape. You can have a not full completion by doing so and rotate them with playing with the rotation offset. This is for the radial cloner. You have the grid cloner here. Of course, it clones your shapes along a grid. And if you go in the object subgroup, you can play with the X gap, the Y gap here to offset more or less the clones between them. And of course, if you type in 0 on both axes, you will have all your clones touching each other. And you can play with the count on X, so the number of columns, and on Y, which is the number of rows. Okay, so this is for the grid cloner. And you have the honeycomb cloner that does almost the same thing, but with even and odds alternate rows. So by going into objects, you will have a checkbox here to inverse the direction. You can still play with the gap on X and Y. You have more or less clones on the X axis, on the Y axis, and this is almost the same thing that the grid cloner. And the very last one is the Fibonacci cloner, which is a really nice and beautiful spiral shape that you can find in nature, like in sunflowers, for example, or in some cactus and some other plants. So there are a lot of options to play with, like the count and spiral golden angle, the center, which decreases its size toward the center, but I won't go into all the settings here because it's pretty a deep feature, sorry. So this is it for the Fibonacci cloner. So once you have chosen one of these type, you can click on it. So for example, I will choose the radial cloner, for example. And once you have done that, you end up with one cloner layer. And once you have one cloner layer selected in the timeline, you can then choose among the the huge library of fonts that I've provided with the product. So you can go here in the drop-down list and choose among the fonts that come with MoglyphFX. So for example, I can choose, let's say, Moglyph people here, because I want to have some nice human shapes. So I can choose people, and it has selected this font here. And now I can choose add new glyph. And this is where you will find exactly 100 shapes embedded in the chosen font. So in my case, it is Moglyph people. So I've got 100 people icons, and I can click on one of them to populate them inside the cloner instead of the default square. So for example, I can have a smiley, this one for example, and an angry one here. And as you can see, you will have an alternate clone here. So if I close this one, you can see that now I have the Moglyph cloner effects plus some new effects that have come here on top of the effect stack, and they come with the for each shape I've added, I have a corresponding effect with its number in the grid. So as you can see, if I go over this one, you have the number glyph 97 that appears, and this one 99, and this is the number of each glyph that you have in this 100 grid. And you can still change this number after a while. So if I'm not satisfied with one of these shapes, I can change them after a while. Okay, so I will let this one this way, and I will choose another one for, let's say, the bad one. Okay, and you can then play with the object settings, add maybe more counts, and as you can see, I have an alternate way of each clone which cycles itself. It does first glyph, second glyph, first glyph, second glyph, so first glyph, second glyph, first glyph, second glyph, etc. And you are not bound to have this iteration in a cycle mode. You can, if you choose to randomize them, you can go in the clones here and choose randomize. And now I can play with the seed and have a randomization between my both shapes. So this is pretty cool, and this is how all the clone types work. They have different settings in the object, but they all share a same common settings, which is clones, iterate, or randomize depending on the shape, the different shapes you have added from the font. And once you have satisfied with the clones and the way the cloner distributes your clones, you can then change all the clones at the same time by twirling down the second group in the cloner effect, which is called transform. And by the way, this is the same subgroup for all the cloner types. And in the transform, you can play with, let's say, the position on X, on Y, on Z. If you have a 3D shape, you can scale on X, on Y. You can turn in rotation Z, for example. So if you have to make, let's say, a wheel or a funfair big wheel, you can make your clones rotate this way. You can play with the visibility, you can play with the fill color, and by the way, it will affect the color of all your clones. But once you have added some new clones by going in Add New Glyph, you are able to choose another color for each clone. So, for example, the first one, which is my smiley in the plain color here, I can twill down the style in the Glyph 1 effect and uncheck the colors from cloner, because right now it will look at the fill color from the transform subgroup of the Moglyph cloner. But once you uncheck this, you are able to recolorize them. And this is the same principle for all the cloners types. Okay, cool. So let me undo this. So, okay, like that. And once you have a cloner with the shapes you want, and by the way, just to let you know, if you don't really know which font to choose in order to have interesting shapes for your project, don't hesitate to go on the website, and on the products page at the very bottom of the page, you will find this orange link, which is called MoglyphFX Fonts Glyph Appendix, that you can download. And once you have downloaded this, okay, you have all the clones available, all the glyphs available in each font. So if you are interested in, for example, this cross here, you can see that this is the glyph number 38 contained in the Moglyph Basic Geometry font. So let's return in After Effects. If I create a new cloner here, let's say a grid this time, I can choose a basic geometry, grid cloner, add new glyph, and my glyph is here, number 38. Okay, so I can click on it, and again, it will come and replace the default square. And you have a really huge amount of different glyphs. So you have directional forms for arrows, for example. You have some radial ones. You have some interesting shapes that you want to clone onto a spline, for example, with a spline cloner, of course. You can have some nice icons for UI design, some people shapes, the one I've used in my previous example, some nice honeycomb shapes that you will want to use in the honeycomb cloner, for example, like these hexagons, or these nice dragon or fish scales, and some nice motion design patterns, which are quite cool. And yeah, there are almost 2,000 and more glyphs embedded in all the fonts I've provided in the fonts since today. So let's return in After Effects. I will continue my demonstration with this grid cloner, and I can go over there and have, let's say, 5 by 5, and I will select it. And once you have satisfied, you are satisfied with all this, so the clone shapes and the distribution thanks to the cloner types, you can go to Animate. This is where you will find all the effectors. And by the way, these are effectors like the ones you find in Cinema 4D, for example. And I will just demonstrate the simplest one because this is a Quickstart tutorial. So let me show you with the Plain Effector. So I select my cloner, I click on Plain Effector, and instantly you can see all the clones rise toward the top of the composition, and they are colored red. This is because once you have clicked on one of these effectors with the cloner selected, it has applied a new effect called effector and the kind of effector you have created. So in my case, it's a plain effector. And in the parameters, you can see that the transform subgroup has default value in the position Y of -100 here. in pixels. So this is why all my clothes have been pushed up to 100 toward the top of my composition, and if I zero out this one, it has been reset. Okay, so I can play with the Y position, the X position, the Z position, the rotation on X and Y if it's a 3D layer, but you can also play with the rotation Z to transform them in 2D. You can even skew them if you want to. You can change the anchor point, and for example, if I play with the anchor point on X and if I type 100 and if I now rotate them, you can see that the crosses are now turning around the bottom of their shape, and this is why the anchor point Y has been chosen. And I will zero this out, and as you can see now it's perfectly centered. So let's zero out all this and we do the minus 100 default value. And by the way, if you understand correctly the effector Plain Effector, you will understand how all the effectors work, because they are all working the same way. You have always a subgroup called Effector, where you'll find the specific settings for each different effectors, and the Plain Effector is the simplest one, so you just have a strength that you can play with. But other effectors will have some different options, like randomness. If you choose a random, if you choose a formula, you will have some formula settings here. The time, you will have some time, etc. So this is in the effector subgroup. And for all the effectors, if you drill down the parameters and you play with one of these subgroups, so transform, you'll of course transform all the spatial transformation properties. Style will allow you to change the color, the fill, the stroke for all your clones. And other is rather text oriented, so you have spacing, you can blur them on X or Y, you can modify glyph, and as you can see, if it's 0 it will not change, but if I return in my add new glyph here, if I want my clones to change, not to be the cross, but to be, let's say, this nice like Dragon Ball star inside a circle, so it's glyph number 73, I can change the 0 here to 73, and they will all become this new shape, right? But the magic of this, and the style in the Plain Effector is red, because by default, if I check colors from cloner, it will inherit the color from the transform of the Moglyph cloner here, which is green. So if I check this, it will recolor them the same than the cloners. Okay, but if I uncheck this and if I change this, I will have a different color. And I can play with the brightness, the stroke, thickness, the color of the stroke, etc. So let's drill up these parameters for now. And the magic of all the effectors is really in their Falloff options. So if I drill down the Falloff options, and by the way, all the Falloff settings are the same for all the effectors. If I drill down the Falloff, I can now play with the completion, which is from 0 to 100% by default. But if I decrease this value, as you can see, we can see that our clones are more or less affected by the effectors depending on this percentage. So let's say I choose 10, for example. I can now play with the completion offset, or let me change to this value, for example, so 25, and it's increased to 10, for example. Now, as you can see, the 10 first persons aren't affected by my effector plane, and I can choose to play with the completion offset that you can decrease or increase to animate all your clones, which is pretty cool. Okay, think of it as the range selector in text layers, because MoglyphFX is just a text layer after all, and all these effectors rely on range selectors. So you can play with this offset. Okay, let's change this here, and you are not bound to have some smoothness, because as you can see, if I play with the offset, you can see that the shape changes smoothly, progressively between this shape and this shape, but you are not bound to have this behavior. You can choose to have them like a cut transition, right? So to do so, just decrease the smoothness to 0. And now if I play with the offset, as you can see, it's perfectly it's perfectly transitioned as a cut, right? And if I go to parameters, transform, and just zero out the position Y, which is the default value of the Plain Effector, I can see now that I can change the shapes and the colors just by playing with this range completion offset. And there is something cool too, which is the ability to randomize this. But to do so, you will have to select your effector in the effector panel and click on this option here, which is randomize falloff order. If you do so with one effector or several effectors selected here, it will automatically randomize, as you can see, your range. And now if you play with the completion offset, you have this animation, okay, which is pretty cool too. And if you don't want to offset but to play with just completion end, you can change all the clones with different timings, okay, which is pretty cool too. If you wanna just make an animation transition from a state A to a state B, for example. And another cool thing is that if I reselect it and uncheck this, I will retrieve my normal behavior. And if I want to, I could animate this range by lines and not by glyph. So to do that, just select your effector again and click on the second option called linear falloff. If you do so, as you can see now, I don't have any, when I play with the completion, I don't have any clones that are transitioning inside each line. It's the transition animation by line, which is pretty cool too. And by the way, you can combine both concepts by selecting it again and click on randomize. And now I can play with this option, and it will both randomize the order of and the lines. And yeah, this is how it works. And as soon as you have randomized it, you can play with the randomized source if you want to, if you are not satisfied with the way it's animated. And this principle are the same for all the effectors here. So let me show you. You can to remove an effector, you can just disable it with the little fx, or selected, going help mat here in the third tab and click on remove effect. And just to demonstrate you some cool effectors, I can, for example, select it and add a random effector, and it will randomize the scale and the color hues of your clones, because the default values in the parameters are 50% in the scale X and Y, and the fill hue is on one full turn. So if I zero it out, and if I play with just subtle values here, as you can see, I can randomize the colors as well. Okay, and if you want to change the animation, you can just play with the effectors different options. As I said before, the plane had just one single strength option, but the randomness, the random effector has way more options to play with. You have the maximum, the minimum, the mode of random. So random here will be animated in cuts. Okay, and you have noise, you have Gaussian, and wiggle. And you have the animation speed. If you want them to remain still, you can put just 0 and you have a still random. If you want to animate them really quickly, you can increase the value here. And which is cool, what is cool with the wiggle option is that it will loop from the start of your composition to the end of your composition. Okay, cool. So if I remove this one, so actually let's remove all this. Let's create a new radial. Let's add a circle. Okay, and let's add one more or a few more glyphs and select it. Click on the delay, and now, since I have the same options than yours, you should have this nice animation, which is pretty cool. So it's a sequential animation with a nice spring bouncing delay, thanks to the delay effector. So you have plenty of options to play with, but this is a pretty deep feature. You have other effectors, so I won't go too deep right now because it's just a quick start tutorial. I hope this quick start tutorial has been useful for you, and don't hesitate to comment and share if you find it useful. See you later, guys. Bye.